In the heart of Mississippi, where the river bends like a wound that never healed, and cotton grows taller than men's dreams, there exists a story that history never cared to record. It was spoken in kitchens, murmured in the fields, and carried by the wind through the cane, but never written down. It is a story about a feast, and about what happens when the hands that feed decide they have fed enough. The year was 1849. The Riverside Mansion, with its white columns, perfumed corridors, and gardens heavy with magnolia, stood as one of the grand symbols of the Old South's certainty in itself. Within its walls, on a cold January evening, 17 of Warren County's most respected names gathered to celebrate a marriage. By dawn, the house was silent, and the dining room, once bright with candles and laughter, had become a room of stillness. The doctors who came later would not understand what they saw. Faces contorted in shapes that no natural death should carve. Hands clenched around silver utensils, eyes staring at nothing. The word poison appeared in the local paper, but never the full truth. The real story began in the kitchen, in the calloused hands of a woman the guests had never met, though they had eaten from her skill for years. Her name was Celia, a cook, a slave, a woman whose entire life had been spent turning other people's hunger into comfort. On that night, she turned it into justice, served warm, sweet, and without mercy. The Riverside Plantation spread over 2,000 acres of soil fattened by blood and rain. It was one of those estates that defined the power of its owner, vast, self-contained, and unbending. Colonel James Riverside ruled it as men like him ruled everything, with discipline, calculation, and the certainty that Providence agreed with them. He was tall and whip-thin, with hair the color of ash and a gaze that seemed always to measure and never to see. He believed himself kind, which made his cruelty worse. He thought a measured hand and occasional praise were better than the lash, but the fear in his slave's eyes was proof enough that kindness was only another shape of control. 340 people lived under his command, most in the fields, some in the stables, a few within the house itself. But only one had access to the heart of the mansion, the kitchen. Celia. She had been 8 years old when she was purchased from a failing plantation in South Carolina. Small, silent, with quick eyes that seemed to memorize everything. The auctioneer described her as useful for housework. The colonel's wife thought she had a delicate face and might grow into a good servant. No one noticed the way she watched, the way she listened. The kitchen was her world. There, under the heat of the stoves and the constant clang of iron pots, she found the only space where she could breathe without permission. The woman who ruled that world was an elder named Mama Ruth, brought from Africa long before Celia was born. Ruth moved with the deliberate grace of someone who had survived storms most could not imagine. She taught Celia the language of flavor, how a pinch of salt could change a man's mood, how smoke could hide bitterness, how herbs from the swamps could heal or harm, depending on the hand that used them. Every root, she told the girl, has two faces, one that saves, one that ends. Ruth's lessons went beyond the kitchen. When the night was long and the work was done, she traced letters in the ashes on the hearth, teaching Celia to read the words from the colonel's discarded newspapers. Knowledge, she said, was the only inheritance that could not be sold. Years passed. Ruth grew frail, Celia grew skilled. By 24, she had replaced her teacher as head cook, and her dishes had become the talk of Warren County. Politicians traveling the river made excuses to stop at Riverside Plantation, claiming business with the colonel but hoping for a taste of her food. Guests praised the tenderness of her meats, the perfume of her sauces, the strange way even simple bread seemed to carry warmth that lingered. They never asked her name. Outside that kitchen, Celia had a husband, Samuel, a blacksmith whose arms were heavy with iron's memory, and 3 children, Thomas, Mary, and little David. In the brutal arithmetic of slavery, they were counted not as family but as assets. Yet within their small cabin at the edge of the quarters, they carved out moments of something like peace. Laughter during storms, whispered songs before sleep. The plantation itself was a world of routines. Dawn bells, field work, punishment, evening hymns. Order so perfect that it hid the rot beneath. For Celia, stability was protection. The colonel would never sell the cook who made him famous. And as long as she was indispensable, her family was safe. That was the lie she chose to believe. In the spring of 1848, the colonel's eldest son returned home. His name was Addison Riverside, 22, pale, and handsome in the way that newspapers called refined. He had studied law in Natchez, but learned nothing of it. What he had learned instead was entitlement. Addison carried with him the arrogance of youth and the boredom of privilege. He had inherited his father's coldness, but none of his restraint. The field hands feared the colonel. They despised his son. At first, his visits to the kitchen seemed harmless. He complimented the food, laughed too loudly, lingered too long. Celia sensed the danger immediately. She began assigning the younger women tasks that kept them out of sight whenever Addison appeared. Still, she felt his gaze, slow, deliberate, crawling across the room like smoke. She prayed that his attention would fade. It did not. It shifted. Addison discovered a new amusement: the children of the quarters. He called it education, a way to teach them respect. The mothers knew better. He made them play games that tested obedience, games that turned cruelty into entertainment. He smiled while they cried. Celia heard whispers. She tightened her guard. The whispers are hard to outrun. The day the fire started was hot enough to bend the air. The fields shimmered like molten glass, and the smell of cane filled every breath. Celia was in the kitchen when she saw the first curl of black smoke rising beyond the window. She dropped the spoon in her hand and ran. By the time she reached the old barn, the roof was already roaring. Flames leapt through the cracks, and the smoke carried a sound she would never forget. 3 voices screaming for her. She tried to rush forward, but arms caught her from behind. Samuel, desperate, pulling her back, shouting that she would die if she went closer. She fought him until the strength left her body. The roof gave way with a shriek of timbers. The screams stopped. When the fire died, they found the children in a corner where the heat had been worst, their small bodies locked together. Thomas's arms wrapped around his brother and sister, as if shielding them even in death. The door's iron latch had been bolted from the outside. Celia knelt in the ashes until night came. No one dared speak to her. Some said she made no sound at all. Others said they heard a noise, like the wind before a storm. 3 nights later, when the last ember in the barn had cooled, Celia lit a single candle in her cabin. Samuel slept, exhausted by grief. She took one of the old recipe books from the kitchen, its pages stained with years of grease and spice, and tore a strip from the back cover. With a piece of charcoal, she wrote 10 words. For Thomas, Mary, and David. Justice will be served. That was the night the cook died. The woman who rose before dawn the next morning was someone else. She began to call herself Celia Washington. No one noticed at first, but in her mind, the name mattered. Washington, after the first man who had fought for freedom, after the idea that liberty was a birthright, not a gift. The irony tasted sweet. Celia continued her work. She smiled when spoken to. She served the colonel his meals with the same careful grace as always. But when night fell, she went to the swamps where Mama Ruth had once gathered herbs and roots. The air there was thick, almost breathing. The water reflected the moon like an eye.
Ruth had told her of plants that could cure fever, others that could stop a heart. Celia remembered them all. She touched each leaf as if greeting an old friend. Some she took for experiments, drying them behind the stove, grinding them to powder, mixing them into broths in infinitesimal amounts. The difference between a dose and a death was something she learned by feel. Weeks passed. Addison Riverside began to fall ill. His appetite vanished. His skin turned sallow. At night he woke drenched in sweat, convinced something was moving under his skin. The plantation doctor diagnosed nervous exhaustion. Celia said nothing. When Pearl Riverside, the colonel's youngest daughter, announced her wedding for January 1849, Celia knew her time had come. A wedding meant celebration, and celebration meant food. 17 guests were invited, family, neighbors, business partners. Every one of them had profited from the system that had burned her children alive. Celia was given full control of the kitchen. She spent days planning the menu, nights rehearsing it in her mind like scripture. She visited the swamps one final time and gathered what she needed. On the morning of the wedding, she awoke before dawn. Frost covered the fields like a thin white veil. The river smoked in the cold. Inside the kitchen, the fire glowed red and steady. Her assistants moved quickly under her direction, unaware of the quiet precision behind every order. By noon, the first wagons began to arrive. Guests in fine coats and dresses stepped down laughing, oblivious to the woman watching from the kitchen window. Celia identified each face, recalling every sin she had recorded in her heart. The Colonel, his wife Rosalind, Addison, the Thompsons from the neighboring plantation, infamous for selling families separately. 17 in all. The ceremony took place beneath an arch of white roses in the garden. The air smelled of smoke from the hearths and of something else. Anticipation. When the guests applauded the newlyweds, Celia was already in the kitchen, ladling soup into porcelain bowls, measuring not by portion, but by guilt. The first course was oyster stew with cream and parsley. The poison she had chosen for it was mild, enough to open the stomach, not enough to close it. The second course, turtle soup enriched with sherry, carried the first true dose. By the time the roasted duck appeared, the fate of everyone at that table was sealed. She moved among the assistants silently, checking every plate. No one questioned her insistence on preparing the final sauces herself. She had earned that right. At 9 o'clock, the sound of laughter filled the dining hall. Glasses clinked. A piano played. The Colonel stood to give a toast. Celia listened from behind the half-open door. Then she heard the first cough. It came from Colonel Thompson, seated near the head of the table. Another followed from his wife, then from a cousin. The coughs turned to gasps, the gasps to screams. Chairs scraped against the floor, dishes crashed. Someone shouted for water. Someone else prayed. Through the confusion, Addison tried to stand. His legs failed him. He looked across the room and saw Celia in the doorway. For a heartbeat, their eyes locked. He understood. Celia did not smile. She simply watched, as if memorizing the scene for her children. One by one they fell, until only silence remained. When it was done, she walked back into the kitchen. The air was thick with the scent of smoke from the lamps, the sweetness of spilled wine, and the faint metallic tang of death. She took off her apron, folded it neatly, and placed it on the table. From her pocket, she withdrew the scrap of paper she had written months earlier, and added 3 new words beneath the old sentence. Justice has been served. She left it where the light would find it. Then she stepped into the night. Outside, the frost had returned. The moon hung low, yellow as old parchment. Somewhere in the fields, an owl cried. Celia Washington did not look back. When the morning light fell over the Mississippi River, the plantation was silent. The servants who entered the main house found no movement, no sound of laughter or clinking dishes, only the faint odor of wine, meat, and something sour they could not name. In the dining hall, 17 bodies sat as if frozen, mid-celebration. A few remained upright in their chairs, their hands still gripping silver forks. Others lay crumpled beside them, heads resting on linen stained with spilled sauce. Candles had burned themselves into puddles of wax. The piano was silent, one key pressed down under the weight of a fallen hand. The children upstairs were still sleeping, their breathing slow, peaceful, untouched by whatever horror had visited the grown-ups below. When the sheriff arrived, he crossed himself before stepping inside. The doctor from Vicksburg followed, pale and sweating. Together they moved among the dead,
whispering about food poisoning, about bad wine, about chance. But nothing explained the expressions carved into those faces. Shock, terror, disbelief, as if they had seen judgment itself arrive at the table. Then someone noticed the note. It lay on the kitchen table, written in a steady, deliberate hand. For Thomas, Mary, and David, justice has been served. Celia Washington. The sheriff read it aloud twice before the meaning sank in. Celia, the cook. He sent men to search the quarters, the stables, the swamps, every path that led away from the property. They found nothing. Her bed was cold, her few belongings untouched. It was as if she had evaporated into the night air. News spread faster than the river current. Within days, every newspaper in Mississippi carried the headline, "The Riverside Wedding Massacre." Reporters arrived from Jackson, Natchez, even New Orleans. They described the scene in breathless tones. 17 prominent citizens dead in a single evening. Theories multiplied. Cursed food, vengeful spirits, northern conspiracies. But those who worked the plantations whispered a simpler story. The intimacy that had bound the household together through habit and necessity fractured overnight. In parlors and verandas, wives whispered that perhaps the old system had gone too far. Husbands laughed too loudly and poured another drink. But at night they dreamed of Celia, the cook who had fed vengeance to the people who thought they owned her. For the slaves, her name became something sacred, not spoken in daylight, but shared at firesides and whispered through the fields. Mothers told their daughters that Celia Washington had walked out of bondage and into freedom, carrying nothing but knowledge and will. Some said she crossed the river disguised as a washerwoman, others that she boarded a steamboat heading north. The sheriff's men searched for months. Rewards were offered. $500, dead or alive. They followed rumors to Tennessee, Kentucky, even Ohio. Each time they arrived too late, or found someone who didn't match the description. The trail went cold, but the fear did not. In the months that followed, cooks across the South were dismissed, replaced by white servants brought at high expense. Food that once united families now carried suspicion. At dinner tables from Charleston to Baton Rouge, prayers were shorter, bites smaller. Men who had never before said grace now bowed their heads before every meal. The Riverside estate itself began to decay. The colonel, once the picture of command, aged 10 years in a season. He stopped attending social gatherings, stopped entertaining guests. The mansion's windows stayed shuttered even at noon. Some nights neighbors said they heard him shouting in his sleep, calling his daughter's name. Samuel, Celia's husband, was questioned repeatedly. He swore he knew nothing, and he didn't. Celia had told him nothing of her plan, but when shown the note she had left behind, Samuel wept, not with anger or fear, but with something like pride. She was stronger than they ever knew, he told the sheriff quietly. She did what I only dreamed of doing. He continued his work at the forge for several years, earning enough to buy his freedom after the colonel's death. Every Sunday he visited the small graveyard at the edge of the property, where 3 modest stones marked the resting place of his children. Locals said he often spoke aloud there, as though expecting someone to answer. By the end of that year, 1849, Mississippi had changed in ways no one could have imagined. Planters increased their patrols,
fearing uprisings that never came. But something deeper had shifted. The unspoken balance of power that rested on fear and habit. Celia had broken the illusion that slaves were content, that obedience was eternal. Every bite of food, every cup of coffee became a question. What if this is the one? For historians, the Riverside case became a curiosity, an unsolved mystery of the antebellum South. But among those who lived its consequences, it was something else entirely. A reckoning.
The newspapers eventually stopped printing her name. The war came, and new horrors replaced the old. Yet in the years that followed, wherever former slaves gathered, on farms, in small churches, in the early settlements of the North, someone would tell the story of Celia Washington. They would tell it softly, the way one handles fire. They said she was seen once in Tennessee, working for a farmer who treated his workers fairly. They said she was older, thinner, but her eyes still carried that calm no one could forget. She stayed there a year, then vanished again. Some believed she reached Ohio, where abolitionists sheltered runaways. Others claimed she lived in Canada under a different name, helping others escape. No one could prove any of it. But the story was enough. The legend grew in the telling. In some versions, she was caught and hanged, smiling as the rope tightened. In others, she lived to old age, surrounded by grandchildren who never knew her past. A few said she still walked the riverbanks at night, searching for the place where her children burned. But every version agreed on one thing. The South was never the same after her. By 1852, the Riverside mansion stood half empty. The Colonel's health failed. The cotton fields yielded less each year, as if the earth itself refused to cooperate. Rumors spread that the house was haunted. Travelers along the river claimed to see a single candle burning in the kitchen window long after the property was abandoned. Those who dared to pass by on stormy nights said they smelled spices in the air, sweet, heavy, and wrong. The land was sold in 1855 to a merchant who tore down the house and planted corn where the mansion had stood. But nothing grew well there. The soil turned sour. Locals avoided it. They called it the cursed ground. Still, Celia's story refused to die. It passed from generation to generation, shape-shifting with time. For some, she was a monster, a warning against rebellion. For others, she was a martyr, a symbol of justice denied too long. In truth, she was neither. She was a woman who had lost everything and answered the world in the only language it understood. The mystery of what happened to her lingered like a half-remembered dream. In 1853, a preacher in Kentucky claimed a woman confessed to him on her deathbed that she had once poisoned her masters in Mississippi. But when he tried to find the body, the record of her burial had vanished. In 1857, an abolitionist pamphlet published in Boston mentioned a cook named Celia Washington who escaped from the Deep South after avenging the deaths of her children. No one knew where the author had learned the story. Perhaps she never left at all. Perhaps she died in the swamps she once walked, the mud closing over her, like forgiveness. Or perhaps she lived quietly, cooking for strangers who never suspected the history in her hands. Whatever the truth, her legacy outlived every plantation that had once feared her name. By the time the decade turned, the story of the Riverside Massacre had become something more than an event. It had become a warning. Children in Warren County grew up hearing whispers of the cook who vanished into the night. Field hands spoke her name with a kind of reverence that was half fear, half pride. And though the masters forbade it, they too could not stop themselves from speaking it, in low voices, behind locked doors, when the lamps burned low. It was said that, for a long while, no one dared to eat at a wedding in Mississippi, that every banquet held a strange quiet beneath the laughter, that every clink of silver on porcelain sounded like the echo of a crime still waiting to be punished. For the planters, Celia's act had struck deeper than any rebellion or escape. She had not run. She had not fought. She had simply waited, patient, invisible, and indispensable. And then, when the moment was right, she had made them all eat what they had sown. And that terrified them more than guns ever could. In time, they tried to erase her. The colonel's descendants destroyed the records of the plantation after his death. The ledger pages that mentioned her name were torn out. The recipe books burned. They said they wanted to end superstition. But what they really wanted was to forget. Forgetting, however, is a luxury the dead rarely grant. After the colonel was buried, servants claimed to hear footsteps in the kitchen at night. Slow, measured, deliberate, like the pacing of someone testing a floorboard before stepping forward. Others swore they saw candlelight flickering through the windows long after the house was abandoned. No one stayed there long enough to find out why. Years later, during the war, soldiers marching through the region found the mansion half collapsed, strangled in ivy. They camped nearby and used the kitchen for warmth. That night, they reported the smell of spices drifting through the air, sweet, almost pleasant, and woke the next morning to find all their rations spoiled. They left before sunrise, leaving the fire still burning. But as he turned to leave, something caught his eye. A rusted cooking pot, half buried in the dirt, its handle still intact. When he lifted it, the wind rose suddenly, carrying with it the faint smell of smoke and something sweeter. He dropped it and walked away quickly, never publishing his article. In the years that followed, Celia Washington's story traveled farther than she ever could. Abolitionists in the North told it as proof that even the powerless could strike back. Southerners told it as a ghost story to frighten disobedient servants. Preachers told it as a parable about sin and retribution. Each retelling reshaped her, polishing her into myth or monster depending on who was listening. But somewhere between the sermons and the legends, the truth endured, quiet, stubborn, like her. Celia had never been a symbol. She had been a mother, and her revenge had been precise, not wild. She had spared the innocent. She had not poisoned the children. She had killed only those who had built their comfort on her pain. The more people tried to explain her away, the more powerful she became in memory. For the men who once ruled the South, she was a ghost that haunted their lineage. For the descendants of the enslaved, she was proof that the powerless are only powerless until they decide otherwise. And for those who cook, the unseen, the silent, the ones whose labor makes life itself possible. She became something closer to a patron saint. By the late 19th century, the name Celia Washington began to appear in strange places. A mention in an abolitionist pamphlet, a footnote in a book about domestic life in the Old South, a story told in an African-American church in Chicago, where an old woman with a faint Southern accent claimed she had once met her as a child. The woman said Celia had come north after the massacre, had taken the name Mrs. W., and had opened a small bakery that sold bread sweetened with molasses. She was quiet, the woman said, and her eyes were sad, but when she smiled, it felt like mercy. No one ever confirmed the story. No records of such a bakery were found. But a few years later, an old Bible turned up in an attic in Cincinnati. On the first page, in faded ink, someone had written, "Remember what they took, and remember what I gave back. C.W." Whether that was her or not, no one can say. But the handwriting was steady, careful, deliberate, like the note she left in the kitchen that night. Over the generations, the tale of the slave cook who served revenge at dinner became part of the region's folklore. Some called her a witch, some a saint. Some refused to believe she had ever existed at all. But every few decades, when a historian would try to disprove her story, something curious would happen. A letter would surface, a diary entry, a newspaper clipping yellowed by time, each one different, but all pointing back to the same night, the same house, the same feast. It was as though history itself refused to let go of her. Today, the site of the Riverside Plantation is nothing but an empty field. The corn that once struggled to grow there has long been replaced by wild grass. If you visit it at dusk, when the light turns the river silver, the land feels strangely restless. There is no sound but the cicadas and the wind through the trees. But sometimes, just sometimes, people say they hear something else. A woman's footsteps on dry leaves, the faint scrape of a spoon in a pot, and, carried on the air, the ghost of a smell, sweet, smoky, and sharp enough to sting the eyes. Locals still avoid the place after dark, but those who are brave enough to stand there say that if you close your eyes and listen closely, you can almost hear her voice, soft, patient, and calm, whispering the same words she wrote on that piece of paper one cold January night so many years ago. For Thomas, Mary, and David, justice has been served. The Riverside family is long gone, their descendants scattered, their name erased from county records after the war. But Celia's name survived, passed down through stories told in kitchens and on porches, in the rhythm of spoons against pots, and in the quiet strength of women who worked unseen. Because that is what history never understood about her. She did not want fame. She did not want legend. She wanted balance. And when the world denied her that, she made it herself. In doing so, she left behind something greater than revenge. She left a lesson that even the most fragile seeming hand can hold the weight of justice, that patience can be deadlier than hate, that memory, when it decides to rise, will not ask permission. More than a century has passed since that night. The mansion has vanished.
The river still winds its way through the same muddy bends, carrying secrets it will never tell. But somewhere in the current, in the hum of the cicadas, in the hush of a kitchen when the fire first catches, the story still breathes. And if you ever find yourself near the old Riverside grounds, when the sun has slipped below the trees and the air tastes like rain, listen closely. You might hear it. A whisper, faint and steady, like a woman reciting a promise she kept long ago. Justice may cool, but it is never forgotten.